Imagine it's the spring of 1837. The air in lower Manhattan is heavy, thick with tension and fear. Men in top hats rush through muddy streets, shouting, waving paper, desperate to sell before it's too late. Banks are collapsing. Fortunes vanish in seconds. The American dream itself feels like it's cracking apart. And standing right there, calm in the middle of the storm, is one man who seems untouched by the chaos. His name is Daniel Drew. He's not frightened. He's not panicking. He's waiting, watching, because Daniel Drew doesn't see a disaster. He sees an opportunity, but to understand how he became the man smiling through America's first great financial collapse, you have to start far away from Wall Street. Daniel Drew wasn't born into money. He was born into mud, hunger, and faith. A poor farm boy from Carmel, New York, raised on hard work and Bible verses. He lost his father young. He walked behind cattle for miles just to earn a few coins. He prayed in cold barns and dreamed of something bigger. Not riches, but escape. America was changing. The roads were turning into railways. The small towns were giving way to cities. And Drew could feel that the new world didn't belong to the honest or the faithful. It belonged to the clever. He became a cattle drover, driving herds to New York City, where he learned something important. People are easy to fool when they're hungry for profit. He'd fatten the cattle with salt and water before selling them, a trick that earned him both fortune and enemies. They called him a cheat. He called it business. He told himself it was just survival, but deep down he liked it. The rush, the deception, the control. By the time 1837 arrived, Daniel Drew had already built his small empire. He owned ships, he loaned money, and he had friends in powerful places. When the market began to fall, most men prayed it would stop. Drew didn't pray. He bet against it. He shorted the stocks that everyone else clung to. And when panic hit, when men jumped from windows and families lost everything, Drew made his move. He sold when others begged. He bought when others bled. And by the time the dust settled, he had turned fear into fortune. Daniel Drew made millions while America burned. But this was only the beginning, because every great rise carries the seed of its fall. So I'll ask you this. If the world around you collapsed and every voice told you to run, would you have had the courage to stay? Daniel Drew wasn't supposed to be here. Not on Wall Street, not in the company of bankers and railroad barons. He came from dirt, from long days driving cattle through rain and mud, sleeping under wagons, eating whatever scraps he could afford. He never had schooling, never learned fine manners or elegant speech. What he had instead was instinct, sharp, dangerous instinct, the kind that comes from scraping survival out of nothing. He could read men better than books, sense fear faster than most could spot opportunity. And fear, he discovered, was the most valuable currency in America. When he first arrived in New York City, the smell of salt and smoke from the docks was overwhelming. Ships from Europe brought goods, immigrants, and dreams. But beneath that noise was another sound, the whispers of speculation. Men talking about stocks, railroads, canals. To Drew it sounded like magic, the idea that paper, just paper, could make you rich. No cattle to feed, no wagons to fix, no sleepless nights under the stars. Just paper and nerve. But the doors to that world were closed to men like him. He was mocked for his rough clothes, for his farmer's talk. They called him the drover, a bumpkin with dirt on his boots, and yet he watched. He learned. He lent small sums to traders, took notes on how prices moved, how panic started, how greed turned men blind. He went to church on Sundays, sitting quietly, pretending to be pious, but his mind was already calculating. He began buying shares in steamboats, slowly taking control of ferry lines that carried goods up and down the Hudson. Every deal was a gamble, but every win pulled him closer to the men who once laughed at him. Still, something inside him stayed restless. He prayed nightly, thanking God for his blessings, but also asking for more. He told himself it wasn't greed, it was providence. God was rewarding his faith and cunning. Yet the more he won, the less peace he felt. It was as if he was walking a narrow bridge between salvation and sin, afraid to look down. But Daniel Drew's early rise was not without scars. Rivals began to circle. Former partners whispered betrayal. He had stepped into a world built on deceit, and every ally was a future enemy. Still, Drew smiled, because he had learned one truth. In a market driven by fear and greed, the man who controls panic controls everything, and soon he would prove it. By the early 1840s, Daniel Drew had transformed from cattle driver to cunning financier. His hands, once rough from rope and rain, now counted stacks of money and signed contracts that could move markets. But with every success came enemies, powerful ones. The steamboat trade was brutal, filled with men just as hungry, just as ruthless. Drew began playing the same game they did, but better. When competitors tried to undercut his prices, he slashed his own lower, even if it meant losing money. Because he understood something they didn't. Control mattered more than profit. Once he dominated the routes, he could raise prices again, and they'd have no choice but to pay. It worked. Soon, Drew's boats were the arteries of New York commerce. Every ton of freight that moved on the Hudson passed under his watch. But inside, he wasn't satisfied. He had tasted power, and it was intoxicating. He began venturing beyond shipping into the world of railroads and stocks. To him, the stock market wasn't just business. It was a battlefield of minds. There were no horses or guns here, only information, deception, and timing. He joined a circle of speculators who played with millions as if they were gambling chips. They would buy rumors, sell hope, and spread lies, and Drew was a natural. He'd start whispers in taverns about an upcoming boom, watch prices rise and sell just before the crash. He became a master manipulator, a man who could move markets with a word. But there was one thing he always said that revealed the strange contradiction inside him. "The Lord is my shepherd," he'd murmur, even as he destroyed other men's fortunes. He believed God was guiding him, that the Bible justified his cunning. But even as he built his fortune, the memory of his roots never left him. He'd sometimes visit his hometown, walking through the fields where his father once plowed. The people saw him as a legend, the poor boy who made it big. But Drew saw something else, distance. He no longer belonged to that world. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a shark in a sea of money. And yet, beneath that surface confidence, something darker was growing. He began to realize that every gain came with a hidden cost. Every rival he crushed, every lie he told, left a mark he couldn't wash off. He started to wonder if fortune was blessing him or testing him. But Daniel Drew's biggest test hadn't even begun. Because soon he would meet a man who would turn his world upside down. A young, ambitious tycoon named Cornelius Vanderbilt. And that meeting would ignite one of the fiercest rivalries in American business history. Cornelius Vanderbilt. The name alone carried weight. The Commodore, iron-willed, relentless, and ruthless in business. By the time Daniel Drew crossed his path, Vanderbilt had already built an empire of steamboats and railroads, a man who commanded respect through sheer force of will. Where Drew used cunning, Vanderbilt used intimidation. One fought with whispers, the other with thunder. When they met, it was like flint striking steel. Sparks that would set Wall Street on fire. It began with the Hudson River routes. Drew thought he had secured dominance, but Vanderbilt moved in like a storm. He undercut fares to absurd levels, sometimes running boats for free just to crush competition. Drew retaliated with his usual tricks, spreading rumors, manipulating shares, twisting the press to his advantage. It was a war not of ships, but of psychology. Drew believed he could outthink Vanderbilt. He'd done it before with lesser men, but Vanderbilt wasn't like anyone else. He didn't play games. He broke them. Their feud spilled into the stock market where Drew saw his true calling. The railroads were the future, and Drew became a major figure in the Erie Railroad, one of the key lines running through New York. He was part owner, part schemer, manipulating its shares to his benefit. But Vanderbilt saw the Erie as his next conquest. He began buying up Erie stock, aiming to take control. Drew, ever the manipulator, saw a way to profit from Vanderbilt's hunger. He secretly issued new illegal shares, watered stock, as it came to be known, flooding the market with worthless paper while Vanderbilt kept buying, thinking he was winning. The result was chaos. Vanderbilt spent millions buying shares that Drew had created from thin air. When he discovered the truth, he was furious, swearing vengeance. Drew, on the other hand, laughed quietly to himself, pocketing the money and fleeing to New Jersey to avoid arrest. It was his masterpiece, the ultimate con against the richest man in America. Newspapers called it the Erie War, a financial scandal unlike anything the country had ever seen. For a while, Drew basked in his victory. He believed he had proven that brains could beat brawn, that cunning could conquer even giants. But what he didn't realize was that he had crossed a line he could never step back from. Vanderbilt would never forget, and neither would the markets. Drew's name was now synonymous with deceit. The very system he'd mastered had begun to turn against him, and deep down, though he tried to ignore it, Daniel Drew felt something shifting. The same instincts that once saved him began whispering a warning, that his time at the top would not last forever. But he didn't listen, not yet, because his greatest gamble was still to come. By the late 1860s, Daniel Drew was no longer just a wealthy man, he was one of Wall Street's most feared figures. His name carried the power to move markets. He was a manipulator, a speculator, a master of illusion. But for all his cunning, there was one truth he refused to see. No one wins forever. The market that had made him rich was shifting beneath his feet, growing wilder, faster, and filled with younger, hungrier men. Among them were two of Drew's own protégés, Jay Gould and James Fisk, men who had learned every trick from their old mentor and were now ready to use them against him. The Erie Railroad was still Drew's kingdom, his instrument of power, but the company was bleeding money, weighed down by corruption and chaos. Drew tried to keep control, issuing more watered stock, manipulating prices to cover debts. He was walking a tightrope of deceit, praying it would hold. But behind his back, Gould and Fisk were plotting. They saw an opportunity to take everything, the railroad, the money, and Drew's reputation, and they did it with the same cold cunning he had once used to destroy others. In a desperate bid to fight back, Drew made his final gamble. He bet against the Erie, his own company. He shorted the stock, certain it would collapse under the corruption he himself had sown. It was madness, like setting fire to your own house and hoping to collect the insurance. But Drew believed his instincts, the same instincts that had guided him through every panic before. He told himself he still understood the game better than anyone. He was wrong. Gould and Fisk secretly bought up the shares Drew was selling short, driving the price higher and higher. Drew kept betting, thinking the fall was inevitable, but the price never fell. It rose higher, higher, until the losses began to devour everything he owned. His fortune evaporated in days. The same system that had once bowed to him now crushed him without mercy. He begged for loans, sold properties, and watched his empire collapse. It was the perfect irony. Daniel Drew, the man who had invented the art of stock manipulation, destroyed by his own creation. The student had become the master. The fox had been caught in his own trap. For the first time in his life, Drew felt powerless. No scheme could save him now, and as he sat alone, staring at the ledgers that once told the story of his triumphs, he realized that his gamble hadn't just cost him his fortune, it had cost him his faith. The man who once believed God guided, his every move now wondered if God had finally turned away. When the end came for Daniel Drew, it didn't arrive like a storm. It came quietly, almost politely. A letter from the bank, a foreclosure notice, a lawsuit. The mighty man of Wall Street, once feared and envied, found himself cornered by the very machine he had helped create. The speculator who could move millions with a whisper now couldn't pay his own debts. His name, once printed in headlines as a symbol of power, became a warning, a ghost story told in the parlors of the rich. The city that once bowed to him moved on without mercy. His steamboats were sold, his houses were taken, his partners, his protégé, his supposed friends, they vanished. Gould and Fisk, the same men he had once mentored, stripped him of everything and laughed as they did it. And yet Drew didn't rage. He didn't fight back. He simply looked down at his hands, those same hands that had signed the deals, held the cash, manipulated the market, and whispered, "It's all in God's hands now." He was nearly 70. His health was failing. The markets no longer feared him. In the quiet of his final years, Drew wandered through the streets of New York unnoticed, a relic of a past age. He would visit churches, sitting in the back pew, listening to sermons about greed and sin. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes he'd close his eyes. He gave away what little he had left to a few religious causes, perhaps searching for redemption, perhaps bargaining with heaven, but inside there was a war. The same old battle between faith and ambition, only now it had turned inward. He couldn't stop thinking about the faces of men he had ruined, the families who lost everything in crashes he had engineered. He told himself he had only played the game everyone else was playing, but the truth haunted him. He began writing notes to himself, verses from the Bible, as if trying to rewrite his soul. "The love of money is the root of all evil," he scrawled on one page. "But without it, the world does not move," he wrote beneath it. That was Daniel Drew's life, contradiction carved into flesh. By the time he declared bankruptcy, the public barely noticed. Another gambler fallen, another name erased by time. But to those who remembered, it was poetic justice. The man who once watered cattle, then watered stocks, now drowning in his own illusions, and yet, even as he fell, part of him believed the story wasn't over. He thought redemption might still come, not from the market, but from within. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about this. Every rise carries its price, and every fortune demands a soul in return. The final years of Daniel Drew's life were quiet, almost painfully so. The noise of Wall Street, the shouting, the bells, the manic rush of men chasing dreams, all of it faded into distant memory. What remained was the silence of loss. He lived alone in a small room surrounded by old ledgers and worn-out Bibles. The walls that once echoed with deals and laughter now held only his voice, mumbling prayers, sometimes half-mad, sometimes heartbreakingly lucid. He was a man haunted by the echo of his own ambition. He often thought about the road that had brought him here. The boy from Carmel, walking barefoot behind cattle, dreaming of escape. The young man who learned how to bend truth into profit. The financier who outsmarted giants, who outplayed Vanderbilt, who believed God blessed every deceit that brought success. Now stripped of everything, he saw it for what it was. Not divine favor, but human arrogance dressed in prayer. He realized that every fortune he made came from someone else's loss. Every dollar was borrowed from fate, and now fate was calling in its debt. Sometimes people from his past would come to see him, a former associate, a curious journalist, a banker seeking gossip. They'd find him frail but polite, still quoting scripture, still talking about the street like it was a living being. It's like the sea. he'd say softly.
You think you're sailing it?
But it's always the one carrying you. There was wisdom in his words, born not from triumph, but from ruin. He watched his former rivals die one by one, Vanderbilt buried as a titan, Gould despised but powerful, Fisk shot dead in a scandal.
Drew alone lingered, as if condemned to outlive them all, to remember what they tried to forget.
And in that loneliness came understanding. The market, the railroads, the empires. They were never truly about money. They were about hunger, the kind that never ends, the kind that devours men and leaves only shadows behind. When he finally returned to his hometown, old and broken, some said he came seeking peace. He walked through the same fields where he once dreamed of more, only now he understood that more was the curse. He looked at the sky and whispered, "The Lord giveth,
and the Lord taketh away." But as he turned to leave,
he smiled, not the cunning smile of a schemer, but the weary smile of a man who finally saw the truth. Because for Daniel Drew, the real reckoning was never the crash, the bankruptcy, or the betrayal. It was the moment he realized that his greatest gamble had never been with money. It had always been with his own soul. Daniel Drew died in 1879, old, penniless, and forgotten by the world he once ruled. No crowds came to mourn him. No bankers bowed their heads. He slipped out of life the way he had entered it, quietly, without ceremony. The newspapers gave him a few short lines, noting that the once mighty Wall Street operator had died bankrupt. But they didn't mention the deeper truth, that Daniel Drew's life was not just a tale of wealth and ruin, but a mirror held up to the soul of America itself. He was a man who believed faith and fortune could live in the same heart. He thought he could serve both God and gold. But every victory pulled him further from one and closer to the other.
And in the end, that's what broke him.
He wasn't destroyed by rivals or bad luck. He was destroyed by belief. Belief that he was chosen, that the rules didn't apply to him, that cleverness could outwit consequence. He learned too late that the market doesn't just trade money. It trades time, integrity, and peace. And those are debts no one can short forever. In his final days, Drew would sometimes whisper the same line to anyone who asked about his life. All the bears get killed and all the bulls get killed, but the pigs get slaughtered. It was his way of admitting that greed, no matter how smart it looks, always eats itself in the end. He had spent a lifetime mastering fear, using it, profiting from it, but he never learned to master his own. The fear of losing, of not having enough, of becoming nobody again. That fear drove him, fed him, and finally consumed him, and maybe that's the real lesson in Daniel Drew's story. Not about markets, or money, or power, but about the cost of forgetting who you are in the pursuit of more. He came from nothing and built an empire only to lose it all because he thought he was untouchable. His rise was brilliance. His fall was inevitable. Because no matter how high you climb, you can't cheat the balance sheet of life forever. So now ask yourself, if life gave you Daniel Drew's choices, would you take them? Would you risk your peace for power? Your soul for fortune? Tell me in the comments. If you stood where he stood, with the world collapsing around you, would you have taken that risk, or walked away before it was too late?